David had been dreaming of this moment for 15 years. As he pulled his moving truck into the driveway of 1247 Lakeside Drive, he couldn't help but smile. The house wasn't the biggest on the block, but it had something that made it special, something that had caught his eye the moment he saw the listing online: the private gate. Most people might not think much about a simple wooden gate, but for David, it represented everything he had worked for. Behind that gate was a narrow path that led directly to Crystal Lake. No crowds, no parking hassles, no long walks from the public entrance. Just a peaceful walk from his backyard to the water's edge. He stepped out of the truck and stretched his back. The drive from his old apartment across town had taken longer than expected, but seeing his new home made every minute worth it. The house was a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a wraparound porch. Nothing fancy, but it was his. "Excuse me, are you the new owner?" David turned to see an elderly man walking over from the house next door. He was wearing a gardening hat and had dirt on his knees, probably from working in the flower beds that lined his front yard. "That's me," David said, extending his hand. "David Johnson. Nice to meet you." "Frank Peterson," the man replied, shaking David's hand with a firm grip. "Welcome to the neighborhood. Been wondering who would buy the old Patterson place." "The Pattersons, were they the previous owners?" "Lived here for 30 years, Frank nodded. "Good people, quiet, kept to themselves mostly. You picked a good house, son. That lake access is something special." David's eyes lit up. "That's actually why I bought it. I love fishing, and the idea of walking straight from my backyard to the water, well, it sold me immediately." Frank chuckled. "Can't blame you there. Tom Patterson used to say the same thing. Had his morning coffee on that little dock behind the gate every single day for 20 years. As they talked, David noticed other neighbors starting to peek out from their homes. A woman watering plants on her front porch gave a friendly wave. A man washing his car in the driveway across the street nodded in their direction. It felt welcoming, the kind of neighborhood he had always imagined living in. "How's the HOA around here?" David asked. He had dealt with difficult homeowner associations before and wanted to know what he was getting into. Frank's expression changed slightly. "They're active," he said carefully. "Monthly meetings, lots of rules about lawn care and paint colors. The president, Mrs. Thornton, she likes things done a certain way, but as long as you keep your grass cut and don't paint your house purple, you should be fine." David laughed. "No purple house paint, got it. Any other rules I should know about?" "The usual stuff. No loud music after 10, no parking on the grass, keep your garbage cans out of sight. Nothing too crazy." Frank paused, glancing toward the gate. "They might ask about that lake access of yours eventually. Some folks have mentioned it would be nice if it was more community-oriented." "Community-oriented? Oh, you know how it is. People see something convenient and think everyone should be able to use it. But it's your property, your gate. Tom never let anyone pressure him about it, and neither should you." David felt a small knot form in his stomach, but he pushed the feeling aside. He had checked the property deed 3 times before buying. The gate and the path to the lake were clearly marked as part of his lot. There shouldn't be any issues. Over the next few hours, David focused on directing the movers and getting his belongings into the house. The previous owners had left it in excellent condition. The hardwood floors gleamed. The kitchen appliances were only a few years old, and every room had been freshly painted in neutral colors that David actually liked. But the real treasure was in the backyard. Past the small deck and the neat lawn was the gate. It wasn't much to look at. Just a simple wooden structure about 4 feet high with a latch that opened easily. But when David walked through it for the first time as the homeowner, he felt like he was stepping into paradise. The path was narrow but well maintained, winding through a small cluster of oak trees before opening up to reveal Crystal Lake in all its glory. The water stretched out for nearly 2 miles, surrounded by trees and a few scattered houses on the far shore. A small wooden dock extended about 10 feet into the water, perfect for fishing or just sitting and watching the sunset. David spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking boxes, but his mind kept wandering back to that dock. As evening approached, he decided to take his first official walk as a lakefront property owner. The path through the trees was peaceful. Birds chirped overhead, and he could hear the gentle lapping of water against the shore before he even reached the lake. When he emerged from the trees, the setting sun was painting the water in shades of gold and orange. He walked out onto the dock and sat down, letting his feet dangle in the cool water. This was exactly what he had imagined when he started saving for a house 10 years ago. Back then he was working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. Now at 38 he was a senior project manager at a tech company, and he had finally earned enough to buy his dream home. A fish jumped near the shore, creating ripples that caught the last rays of sunlight. David made a mental note to bring his fishing gear down tomorrow morning. Maybe he would even have his coffee out here, just like the previous owner had done. As he walked back through the gate, David noticed a few neighbors in their yards. A couple was grilling on their deck, and the smell of barbecue drifted through the evening air. The woman from earlier was still tending to her flowers, now with the help of outdoor lights. Everything felt normal and peaceful. Inside his new house, David ordered pizza and spent the evening arranging furniture and hanging pictures. The living room windows faced the backyard, giving him a perfect view of his gate and the trees beyond. Every time he looked out, he felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. This was his home, his gate, his private access to one of the most beautiful lakes in the county. He had worked hard for this moment, and nothing was going to spoil it. As he fell asleep that first night, David listened to the sounds of his new neighborhood. Crickets chirped outside his window, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the gentle sound of water lapping against the shore. It was perfect. He had no idea that by morning, his peaceful new life was about to become much more complicated. 3 months had passed since David moved into his lakefront home, and life had settled into a comfortable routine. Every morning, he would take his coffee through the gate and sit on the dock for 20 minutes before starting his workday. Every evening he would walk the path again, sometimes with his fishing rod, sometimes just to clear his head after long video calls. The neighborhood had been welcoming enough. Frank next door always waved when he saw David in the yard. The couple across the street, the Andersons, had invited him to their 4th of July barbecue. Most of his neighbors seemed friendly, though David noticed he was often the topic of casual conversations that stopped when he got close enough to hear. On this particular Saturday morning, David was in his garage organizing his fishing gear when he heard voices in his driveway. He looked up to see 3 people walking toward him, all dressed nicely despite it being the weekend. The woman leading the group was probably in her 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confident walk that suggested she was used to being in charge. Behind her were 2 men, one about the same age wearing a polo shirt and khakis, the other younger, maybe early 40s, carrying a clipboard. "Mr. Johnson?" the woman called out with a bright smile. "I'm Barbara Thornton, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Do you have a few minutes to chat?" David set down the tackle box he was holding and walked over to meet them. "Of course, Mrs. Thornton. Frank mentioned you might stop by at some point." "Please call me Barbara," she said, extending a manicured hand. "And these are my fellow board members, Robert Mitchell and Kevin Hayes. We wanted to personally welcome you to the neighborhood and discuss a wonderful opportunity for community building." David shook hands with each of them, noting how Robert's grip lingered a bit longer than necessary, and how Kevin kept glancing toward the backyard where the gate was visible. "We know you've been here a few months now," Barbara continued, "and we hope you're settling in well. Frank Peterson speaks very highly of you." "It's been great," David replied honestly. "Really peaceful. I love the lake access." "Ah, yes, the lake access." Barbara's smile grew wider. "That's actually what we wanted to talk to you about. You see, we've been getting quite a few comments from neighbors about that lovely path of yours." David felt his stomach tighten slightly, remembering Frank's warning about this exact conversation. "Comments? Oh, nothing negative," Robert jumped in quickly. "Quite the opposite, actually. Several families have mentioned how convenient it would be if there was easier access to the lake for community events and activities." Kevin nodded enthusiastically. "The main public entrance is nearly half a mile down the road, and the parking situation there is terrible on weekends. Your gate would solve so many problems for the neighborhood." Barbara leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a conspirative tone. "Between you and me, David, we've been looking for ways to increase property values in our little community. Having convenient lake access for all residents would ling point for future buyers." David chose his words carefully. "I can see how that would be appealing, but I'm not sure I understand what you're asking." "Nothing major," Barbara assured him. "We were thinking that perhaps during certain hours or for special community events, residents could use your path to access the lake. Very organized, very respectful. Maybe weekends between 10 and 4 or for our annual neighborhood picnic. The thing is, Robert added, we've done some research, and there might be some legal precedent for community easements in cases like this, especially when it comes to public waterways. David felt his jaw tighten. The mention of legal precedent sounded more like a threat than a friendly suggestion. I'm pretty sure I own that path outright. It was clearly marked on the property deed when I bought the house. Oh, absolutely, Kevin said quickly. We're not questioning your ownership. We're just thinking about what's best for the community as a whole. Barbara stepped closer, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone. David, I'll be frank with you. In neighborhoods like this, community cooperation is everything. The families who work together, who contribute to the greater good, they're the ones who really thrive here. And the ones who don't? David asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Well, Barbara's smile flickered for just a moment. Let's just say that people notice when someone isn't being a team player. It can make things uncomfortable. The 3 board members stood there smiling at him, but David could feel the underlying pressure in their words. This wasn't really a request. It was the first step in a campaign to get what they wanted. I appreciate you coming by, David said slowly, but I'm going to have to think about this. The privacy and exclusive access were big reasons why I bought this particular house. Robert's friendly demeanor slipped slightly. Privacy is one thing, David, but when your actions affect the entire community's quality of life, shouldn't we consider the bigger picture? My actions? David couldn't hide his surprise. You mean using my own property? Now, Barbara interjected, shooting Robert a warning look. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. David, we completely understand your position. This is a big decision, and we want you to feel comfortable with whatever we work out. Kevin pulled a folder from his clipboard and handed it to David. These are just some preliminary ideas about how shared access could work. Time limits, resident-only access, proper maintenance agreements. Nothing set in stone, just thoughts. David took the folder but didn't open it. Like I said, I need to think about this. Of course, Barbara nodded. Take all the time you need. Well, within reason. We're hoping to present something to the full HOA board next month. As the 3 of them turned to leave, Barbara paused and looked back at David. You know, the Pattersons were wonderful neighbors, but they could be a bit set in their ways. Sometimes change is good for everyone involved. After they left, David stood in his driveway for several minutes, still holding the folder. The morning that had started so peacefully now felt heavy and complicated. He walked back into his garage and sat down on an overturned bucket, opening the folder to see what they had prepared. The documents inside were professionally printed and detailed. There were proposed schedules for community access, rules about noise levels and group sizes, even suggested fees that residents would pay for maintenance of the path. It was clear they had put considerable thought and effort into this presentation. What bothered David most was how prepared they were. This wasn't a casual conversation or a spur-of-the-moment idea. They had researched legal precedents, created detailed proposals, and coordinated their approach. How long had they been planning this? He walked through his house to the back door and stepped onto his deck, looking out at the gate that had brought him so much peace over the past 3 months. The morning sun was filtering through the oak trees, and he could hear birds singing on the other side of the fence. This was his sanctuary. After years of apartment living, of sharing walls and dealing with noisy neighbors, he had finally found a place where he could have real privacy. The idea of turning it into a community thoroughfare made his chest feel tight. David pulled out his phone and called Frank next door. Frank, it's David. Did you see the HOA board leave my place a few minutes ago? I saw them walking up your driveway. Frank's voice was cautious. Let me guess. They want access to your gate. How did you know? Frank sighed. Because they asked Tom Patterson the same thing every year for the last decade. He always said no, and it always caused tension at the monthly meetings. What kind of tension? The kind where people start finding violations with your mailbox placement and complaining about the color of your front door. Nothing illegal, but enough to make life annoying. David felt his heart sink. So you think they'll retaliate if I say no? I think Barbara Thornton is used to getting her way, and she doesn't handle rejection well. But David, that's your property. You have every right to say no. After hanging up, David walked through his gate and down to the dock. The lake was mirror-smooth in the morning calm, reflecting the clouds perfectly. A family of ducks paddled by, leaving gentle wakes in the water. This was exactly why he had bought this house. Not for community events or property value increases, but for moments like this. Quiet, private moments where he could think and breathe and just exist without the pressures of the world. But as he sat there, David couldn't shake the feeling that his peaceful mornings were numbered. The way Barbara had smiled when she mentioned that people notice when someone isn't being a team player. The casual mention of legal precedents. The fact that they had come prepared with detailed proposals. This was just the beginning. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after David's conversation with the HOA board. He was getting ready for work when he noticed the official-looking envelope in his mailbox, complete with the Willowbrook Estates HOA logo in the corner. Inside was a formal letter on letterhead, dated 3 days earlier. Dear Mr. Johnson, as discussed during our recent meeting, the Willowbrook Estates HOA Board is requesting your cooperation regarding community access to lakefront areas. After reviewing our community guidelines and consulting with legal counsel, we believe there may be grounds for establishing reasonable public access easements to Crystal Lake through existing private pathways. David read the letter twice, his coffee growing cold in his hand. The friendly tone from their face-to-face meeting was completely gone, replaced by formal language that sounded more like a legal document than a neighborhood discussion. The letter continued. We understand you may have concerns about this proposal, but we must emphasize that community cooperation is essential for maintaining property values and neighborhood harmony. We strongly encourage you to reconsider your position and work with us to find a mutually beneficial solution. At the bottom, in smaller print, was a line that made David's blood run cold. Please be advised that continued non-compliance with community standards may result in fines and other enforcement actions as outlined in the HOA covenants. David immediately called the real estate lawyer who had handled his home purchase. Janet Reynolds had been recommended by his realtor and had seemed thorough during the closing process. Janet, it's David Johnson. I bought the house on Lakeside Drive a few months ago. I need to ask you about HOA easements and property rights. Of course, David, what's going on? David explained the situation, reading portions of the letter over the phone. Janet listened quietly, occasionally asking clarifying questions about exactly what the HOA board had said. David, let me be very clear about this, Janet said when he finished. I reviewed your property deed personally during the sale. That gate and pathway are entirely on your private property. There are no easements, public or private, that would give anyone else access rights. What about their mention of legal precedent? Complete nonsense. There's no legal mechanism that would force you to provide community access to a public lake through your private property. They're trying to intimidate you. David felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly replaced by anger. So they're basically lying to me? They're using legal-sounding language to pressure you into giving up your property rights voluntarily. It's a common bullying tactic. My advice is to respond in writing, clearly stating that you will not be providing access to your private property, and keep copies of everything. That evening, David sat at his kitchen table crafting a response letter. He kept it polite but firm, clearly stating that he would not be granting access to his private property, and that any further attempts to coerce him would be considered harassment. He mailed the letter the next morning, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next 2 weeks, David began to notice subtle changes in his neighborhood interactions. The friendly waves from neighbors became less frequent. Conversations that had been warm and welcoming turned brief and formal. The Andersons across the street, who had invited him to their barbecue, now barely acknowledged him when he was outside. Then came the second letter. This one was even more formal than the first, with Carby. It'd be a huge sale on copies listed for multiple recipients, including Willowbrook Estates Legal Committee and Community Standards Board. Mr. Johnson, your recent communication indicates a fundamental misunderstanding of community obligations within our neighborhood. While we respect property ownership rights, we must also consider the broader implications of individual decisions on community welfare and property values. The letter went on to cite various sections of the HOA covenants about community, cooperation, and maintaining neighborhood standards. David pulled out his copy of the HOA documents and spent hours reading through the dense legal language, looking for anything that could possibly apply to his situation. There was nothing. The covenants covered lawn maintenance, architectural changes, noise ordinances, and pet policies. Nothing about sharing private property with the community. But the letters kept coming. The third letter arrived with a copy of David's property deed attached, with certain sections highlighted in yellow. Upon further review of your property boundaries, the HOA board has identified potential discrepancies in the current fence line that may impact community access rights. David stared at the highlighted sections, trying to understand what they were claiming. The deed was clear, and the fence had been professionally surveyed when it was installed by the previous owners. He called Janet Reynolds again. "They're fishing," she said after David read her the latest letter. "They're hoping you don't understand property law and will get scared by official-sounding language. David, I want you to document everything. Every letter, every interaction, every conversation. If this escalates, we'll need a clear record of harassment." Documentation became David's new routine. He kept a detailed log of every HOA communication, every interaction with neighbors, every change in the community's attitude toward him. The log grew longer each week. Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down, who had always smiled and waved during his evening walks, now turned away when she saw him coming. The teenager who had occasionally asked David about his fishing gear suddenly found other routes to take through the neighborhood. Most troubling were the comments David began overhearing during his trips to the mailbox or while working in his front yard. "Some people just don't understand what it means to be part of a community," he heard one neighbor say to another. "I don't know why anyone would be so selfish about something that could benefit everyone," came another conversation that stopped abruptly when the speakers noticed David nearby. The social isolation was subtle but unmistakable. David found himself planning his outdoor activities around times when he was less likely to encounter neighbors. His peaceful evening walks through the neighborhood became tense exercises in avoiding eye contact and uncomfortable silences. Then came the inspection notice. The Willowbrook Estates HOA will be conducting a routine property compliance inspection of 1247 Lakeside Drive on Saturday, November 15th between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Property owner presence is required. David called Janet immediately. "Can they do this?" "Just show up and inspect my property? Check your HOA covenants," Janet advised. Most associations have some inspection rights, but they're usually limited to exterior items and common areas. They can't enter your house or inspect private areas without specific violations being reported. David spent Friday evening rereading the HOA documents. The inspection clause was buried in subsection 4.7. The association reserves the right to inspect exterior property features to ensure compliance with community standards, including but not limited to landscaping, structures, and boundary maintenance. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly. David stood at his front window at 8:45 a.m., watching for the inspection team. At exactly 9 a.m., Barbara Thornton arrived with 2 men David didn't recognize, both carrying clipboards and cameras. For the next hour, they methodically examined every visible aspect of his property. They measured his mailbox distance from the curb, photographed his fence line, and spent considerable time examining the gate and discussing something in hushed tones. David watched from inside, documenting their activities with his own camera. When they knocked on his door at 10:30, he was ready. "Good morning, David," Barbara said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just finishing up our routine inspection. Everything looks fine, but we did notice that your back fence might be slightly over the property line near the lake access point." "The fence was professionally surveyed when it was installed," David replied calmly. "I have the documentation if you'd like to see it." "Oh, I'm sure it was," Barbara said dismissively. "But sometimes these things shift over time. Weather, ground settling, that sort of thing. We'll need to have our own surveyor take a look." One of the men with her stepped forward. "We also noticed some maintenance issues with the gate mechanism. Looks like it might not be meeting safety standards for a lakefront access point." David stared at him. "Safety standards for my private gate? Well, if there's any possibility of community access in the future, we want to make sure everything meets code requirements." The boldness of the statement took David's breath away. They were still talking about community access as if it was inevitable, as if his clear refusal had never happened. "Gentlemen, ladies," David said firmly, I want to be absolutely clear. There will be no community access through my property now or in the future. That gate is private and it will remain private. Barbara's smile finally faded completely. David, I really think you're making a mistake. This community values cooperation and compromise. People remember when neighbors are willing to work together, and they also remember when they're not. After they left, David sat in his kitchen and wrote down every detail of the conversation while it was still fresh in his memory. The threatening undertone of Barbara's final comment was unmistakable. This was no longer about lake access. This had become a test of wills, and David was beginning to realize just how far the HOA was willing to go to get what they wanted. That evening, he walked through his gate and down to the dock as the sun was setting. The lake was choppy from the day's wind, and the sound of small waves against the shore was oddly comforting. He had bought this house for moments like this. Peaceful solitude at the end of a long day. But now, even sitting on his own dock, David couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, judged, and planned against. The war for his gate had begun, and David was starting to understand that his opponents had no intention of fighting fair. David first noticed the footprints on a cold Monday morning in December. The ground around his gate was soft from the previous night's rain, and there were clearly several sets of muddy boot prints leading through his private pathway to the lake. He followed the prints down the path, his anger building with each step. Not only had someone used his gate without permission, but they had left muddy tracks all over his wooden dock and even left behind an empty beer bottle floating in the water near the shore. David took photos of everything and immediately called the non-emergency police line to report the trespassing. Officer Rodriguez arrived within an hour, a middle-aged man with a professional demeanor who listened carefully as David explained the situation. "So this is definitely your private property?" Officer Rodriguez asked, checking the gate and the clearly marked private property signs David had installed the month before. "Absolutely. I have all the documentation right here," David said, pulling out copies of his property deed and survey documents. Officer Rodriguez nodded as he reviewed the papers. "Everything looks in order. Did you see who was on your property?" "No, but I have security cameras that might have caught something." David had installed the cameras 2 weeks earlier, partly for security and partly because his lawyer had suggested documenting any future incidents. They walked back to David's house to review the camera footage on his computer. The timestamp showed 3 people had come through the gate at around 11:30 p.m. the previous night. The video was dark and grainy, but David could make out 2 adults and what looked like a teenager. "I can't make out faces from this angle," Officer Rodriguez said, "but I can definitely see trespassing occurred. I'll file a report and we'll keep an eye on the area during evening patrols." That afternoon, David decided to confront the HOA directly. He knew there was a good chance they had encouraged this trespassing, either directly or by continuing to tell residents that community access was just a matter of time. Barbara Thornton's house was only 3 blocks away, a large colonial with perfectly manicured landscaping, and a HOA president sign prominently displayed by the front door. David rang the bell and waited, still holding photos of the muddy footprints on his property. Barbara opened the door wearing a silk blouse and an expression of surprised annoyance. "David, what can I do for you?" "Someone trespassed on my property last night," David said without preamble. "They went through my gate, used my dock, and left trash behind. I've filed a police report." Barbara's eyebrows rose. "That's terrible. Though I have to say, if you opened your gate to community access, these kinds of misunderstandings wouldn't happen." David stared at her. "Misunderstandings? Someone broke into my private property. Now, David, let's not be dramatic. These are your neighbors we're talking about. I'm sure whoever it was didn't mean any harm. Do you know who it was?" Barbara's pause was just long enough to confirm David's suspicions. "Of course not. But I've heard some residents expressing frustration about the lake access situation. People are feeling like you're not being very neighborly." "Neighborly doesn't include breaking into my backyard. Maybe if you reconsidered our proposal, people wouldn't feel the need to improvise." The casual way she said it made David's blood boil. She was essentially admitting that the HOA was encouraging people to trespass on his property as a pressure tactic. "Mrs. Thornton, I want to be very clear about something."
Anyone who comes through that gate without my permission is trespassing, and I will call the police every single time."
"That includes you, other board members, and anyone else you might send." Barbara's friendly mask finally slipped completely. "You know, David, I've been trying to work with you, but your attitude is really becoming a problem for this community. People are starting to talk." "What kind of talk?" "The kind of talk that happens when someone moves into a nice neighborhood and then refuses to be part of the community. People notice things like that. They remember." David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm simply observing that community relationships matter in a place like this. Your property values, your daily life, your sense of belonging. It all depends on how well you get along with your neighbors." That evening, David called his lawyer Janet Reynolds and recounted the conversation word for word. "David, I want you to start recording these interactions," Janet said. "What she's doing sounds like intimidation, and we need to document it clearly. Also, I think it's time to send the HOA a formal cease and desist letter. Will that help? It will put them on legal notice that their behavior constitutes harassment. If they continue after that, we'll have grounds for stronger action." The cease and desist letter was delivered to the HOA board on Thursday. By Saturday morning, David's phone was ringing. "Mr. Johnson, this is Kevin Hayes from the HOA board. We received your lawyer's letter, and frankly, we're disappointed that you felt the need to escalate things to this level." "I escalated things?" David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You've been sending me threatening letters for 2 months and encouraging people to trespass on my property." Now that's simply not true. The HOA has never encouraged any illegal activity. We've simply been trying to find a solution that works for everyone. By threatening my property values and community standing, David, I think you're misunderstanding our intentions. We're trying to prevent exactly the kind of community conflict you seem determined to create. That evening, David discovered that someone had been through his gate again. This time they had left the gate wide open and there were tire tracks in his yard, as if someone had driven an ATV or golf cart through his property. The security cameras showed the same thing as before, shadowy figures around 11 p.m., too dark to identify clearly. But this time David could see that whoever it was had deliberately left the gate open when they left. David called Officer Rodriguez again. When the officer arrived and saw the tire tracks, his expression became more serious. "This is escalating," Rodriguez said. "First time could have been kids being stupid. But this looks more intentional. Someone's trying to send you a message. What can I do?" "Keep documenting everything. Consider upgrading your security cameras to get better night vision and—" Rodriguez paused, looking uncomfortable. "You might want to think about how far you're willing to take this. Sometimes backing down is the smart play." David stared at him. "Are you seriously suggesting I should give in to harassment and let people use my private property?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes community peace is worth more than being right. But that's your call to make." After Officer Rodriguez left, David sat in his kitchen and stared at the photos of tire tracks crisscrossing his backyard. The message was clear. The HOA and their supporters were no longer pretending this was about community cooperation. This was about forcing him to comply through escalating harassment. David walked through his house, checking all the locks and making sure his security system was armed. Then he went upstairs to his bedroom window and looked out at his backyard. In the moonlight, he could see the gate standing open like a wound in his fence. For the first time since moving to Willowbrook Estates, David felt afraid in his own home. Not afraid of physical violence, but afraid of the slow, steady campaign of intimidation that seemed to be building around him. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Nice house. Shame if the community stopped feeling welcome there." David's hands shook as he screenshotted the message. Janet had been right about documenting everything, but the documentation was starting to paint a picture that scared him. This wasn't just about lake access anymore. This had become something much darker. He walked downstairs and stood at his back door, looking out at the gate that had brought him so much joy just a few months ago. Now it felt like the center of a war he never wanted to fight. But as he stood there, David felt his fear slowly transforming into determination. He had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let bullies drive him out of his dream home. If they wanted a war over his gate, they were going to get one. But first, he was going to make sure he had the law on his side. David picked up his phone and started dialing. It was time to involve the police in a much bigger way. The turning point came on a frigid Tuesday morning in January. David woke to find his gate not just open, but completely removed from its hinges. The wooden structure was lying in pieces in his backyard, and someone had spray-painted community property across his fence in red letters. This time, David didn't hesitate. He called 911. Detective Lisa Park arrived with 2 patrol officers, and her expression grew increasingly serious as David walked her through months of documented harassment. She examined the security footage, read through the threatening letters, and reviewed the photos of previous trespassing incidents. "Mr. Johnson, this isn't just vandalism anymore," Detective Park said. "This is a pattern of criminal harassment and intimidation. I want you to know that we're taking this very seriously." While the detective was still documenting the scene, Barbara Thornton arrived at David's front door with 2 other HOA board members. They claimed they had heard about the vandalism and wanted to check on David's well-being. "Such a shame," Barbara said, looking at the destroyed gate. "You know, if you had worked with us on community access, none of this would have happened." Detective Park stepped forward, badge clearly visible. "Ma'am, are you saying the HOA was involved in this vandalism?" Barbara's face went pale. "Of course not. I was simply saying that community tensions might not have escalated if Mr. Johnson had been more cooperative. So you're blaming the victim for criminal activity on his property?" No, that's not what I meant," Barbara stammered. Detective Park handed Barbara her business card. "I'll need to speak with you and the entire HOA board as part of this investigation. Please call me today to schedule interviews." After the HOA members left, Detective Park sat with David in his kitchen and explained what would happen next. "Based on what you've shown me, I believe we have enough evidence to pursue criminal charges against multiple individuals," she said. "The text threats, the pattern of trespassing, the escalating vandalism. This goes way beyond a neighborhood dispute. What about the HOA board? If we can prove they encouraged or coordinated this harassment, they could face charges for conspiracy and intimidation." The fact that Mrs. Thornton essentially admitted knowledge of the situation in front of me was very helpful. Over the next 3 days, Detective Park interviewed neighbors throughout Willowbrook Estates. What she discovered was a systematic campaign of harassment that went far beyond what David had experienced directly. Several neighbors, when promised anonymity, admitted they had been pressured by HOA board members to participate in the harassment. Others revealed that Barbara Thornton had made explicit threats about property values and community standing to anyone who didn't support the campaign against David. Frank Peterson, David's elderly neighbor, finally came forward with information he had been afraid to share. "Barbara told me directly that they were going to make David's life miserable until he gave in," Frank told Detective Park. "She said they had ways of dealing with people who didn't fit in with community values." The most damaging revelation came from a teenage neighbor named Alex Turner. His parents had been active in the harassment campaign, but Alex had grown uncomfortable with what he was being asked to do. "Mrs. Thornton gave me $50 to go through Mr. Johnson's gate and mess up his dock," Alex admitted to Detective Park with his parents present. "She said it wasn't really trespassing because the community deserved access to the lake." Detective Park also discovered that the HOA had been researching David's background, employment, and personal life in ways that bordered on stalking. They had contacted his workplace multiple times with vague complaints about community disturbances involving their employee. On Friday morning, Detective Park called David with an update that made his hands shake. "We're moving forward with arrests," she said. "Barbara Thornton and 2 other board members are being charged with conspiracy to commit harassment, intimidation, and filing false police reports. We also have evidence of trespassing and vandalism charges against several residents." "False police reports?" "They filed multiple complaints claiming you had been threatening neighbors and creating disturbances. When we investigated, we found all the complaints were fabricated. That's a serious crime." The arrests happened the following Monday. David watched from his front window as police cars arrived at houses throughout the neighborhood. Barbara Thornton was led away in handcuffs from her perfectly manicured colonial, her face a mask of shock and rage. Local news picked up the story that evening. "HOA harassment campaign leads to multiple arrests," ran as the lead story on 3 different channels. David declined to be interviewed, but the story made it clear that he had been the victim of an organized intimidation campaign. The legal consequences came swiftly. Barbara Thornton and board member Robert Mitchell were convicted of criminal harassment and conspiracy. They received fines, community service, and restraining orders preventing them from contacting David or approaching his property. Kevin Hayes, the 3rd board member, accepted a plea deal and testified about how the campaign had been organized and coordinated through private HOA meetings that violated the association's own bylaws. The civil lawsuits followed quickly after the criminal convictions. David's lawyer, Janet Reynolds, filed comprehensive civil rights and harassment claims against the HOA and individual board members. They violated your civil rights, engaged in a conspiracy to deprive you of your property rights, and caused significant emotional distress, Janet explained. We're seeking compensatory damages, punitive damages, and legal fees. The HOA's insurance company settled out of court for an undisclosed amount that more than covered David's legal expenses, security system upgrades, and compensation for months of harassment. More importantly, the settlement included a permanent injunction preventing the HOA from any future attempts to claim access to David's property. Barbara Thornton's personal assets were also attached in the civil case. She was forced to sell her house and move out of Willowbrook Estates, a final irony that wasn't lost on anyone who had followed the case. The story gained national attention when a civil rights organization picked it up as an example of HOA overreach and harassment. David found himself featured in magazine articles and television interviews about property rights and community bullying. What people need to understand, David told one interviewer, is that this wasn't really about lake access. It was about power and control. Some people can't accept that they don't have the right to take what belongs to others. The transformation in his neighborhood was remarkable. With the harassment ringleaders gone and the legal consequences clear, David's neighbors began approaching him with apologies and explanations. We got caught up in the group pressure, his neighbor across the street admitted. Barbara made it seem like you were being unreasonable and selfish. We should have thought for ourselves. Many neighbors revealed they had been afraid to speak up against the harassment campaign, worried about becoming targets themselves. The arrests and convictions had broken the climate of fear that Barbara Thornton had created. 6 months after the arrests, David stood on his rebuilt dock watching the sunset over Crystal Lake. The new gate was stronger than the original, with better locks and improved security cameras. But more importantly, he no longer felt like a prisoner in his own home. The path through the oak trees was peaceful again. Birds sang in the branches overhead, and the gentle lapping of water against the shore had returned to being a source of comfort rather than stress. Frank Peterson had helped him rebuild the gate, and several other neighbors had volunteered their time and materials. The community that Barbara Thornton had claimed to represent had revealed its true nature once her toxic influence was removed. David's phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment his heart raced, remembering the anonymous threats from months before. But this message was from Detective Park. Saw the news story about your neighborhood's cleanup day. Glad to see things have turned around. Well deserved. David smiled and put his phone away. The cleanup day had been a neighborhood-wide effort to repair damage and restore community spirit. David had donated money for new playground equipment at the community park, and residents had worked together to beautify common areas. The lake was mirror-smooth in the evening calm, reflecting the first stars of the night. David cast his fishing line into the water and settled back in his chair. This was exactly what he had imagined when he first bought the house. Peaceful solitude, the sounds of nature, and the satisfaction of enjoying something he had earned through his own hard work. A fish jumped near the shore, creating concentric ripples that caught the last light of the day. David made a mental note to try that spot with a different lure tomorrow morning. As he sat there in the gathering darkness, David reflected on everything that had happened. The harassment campaign had been traumatic and expensive, but it had also taught him valuable lessons about standing up for his rights and the importance of community accountability. Most importantly, it had shown him that justice was possible, even when the odds seemed overwhelming. Sometimes doing the right thing meant fighting back against bullies, no matter how organized or intimidating they might be. The gate behind him stood strong and secure, protecting his private access to the lake he loved, and for the first time in months, David Johnson felt truly at peace in his own backyard.